Thomas Theodore Maryland and the Maryland Cryptid Museum. We should start with the collector. Thomas Theodore Maryland was born in 1782 in Hellingshire, northern England. He was the son of a rich aristocrat and biologist, Edward Maryland, and would eventually follow in his father's footsteps of fringe naturalism. His mother had died in childbirth and he was raised by his dutiful father, until Edward's death at the age of 76. Thomas would become introverted and spend the majority of his life in seclusion, traveling extensively to collect bizarre specimens of species that were yet to be catalogued by reputable zoologists and naturalists. Amongst various anomalies attributed to his life, the most peculiar is his lifespan. At aged 80, he still resembled a 40-year-old man, this being remarked upon perhaps more than his incredible collection when he eventually took his specimens on a tour of the Americas. This brief foray into the press garnered much attention. His collection was condemned as a fraud and his life put under intense scrutiny. Yet it is noteworthy that whilst attending a few scientific functions he befriended eminent mathematicians and biologists who were fascinated by his knowledge of fringe physics and chemistry, and was also encouraged to release a paper of theories pertaining to the possibility of time travel. A brief accusation of theft from a fellow collector of the odd saw a public feud, where the impetuous spoilt child in Maryland was brought forth. Any respect gathered from the public was quickly lost. He disappeared back into obscurity. He was presumed dead around the turn of the century, until in 1942 a man purporting to be Maryland donated a building to a London orphanage with the proviso that the basement never be unsealed. The man could be no older than 45, so was presumed to be a relative of Thomas. After this event, he was never heard of again. In 2006, the basement was uncovered during a planned demolition of the building. Within, hundreds of large crates, filled with thousands of specimens, artifacts, and diaries were found. It was dubbed the Maryland Cryptid Collection. Its mere existence would challenge the established scientific community if proven authentic. Within his rather thoroughly detailed diaries, Thomas makes allusions to a number of esoteric ideologies concerning quantum mechanics, theories that were yet to be established at the time they were written. His knowledge of physics, and discoveries of artifacts that challenged historical accounts added to the enigma of his life, and his collection. It is also notable that he mentions an artifact called the alabast, which could be attributed to his unusually long life. Born in 1782 to a rich aristocratic family, his mother died during childbirth and he was raised by his father Edward. His father was a general in the army, but once retired became enamored with esoteric natural history, investing in profitable companies to fund his travels across the world, seeking out elusive artifacts and hidden species which resided in forgotten continents or darkened places, away from prying human eyes. They traveled together for many years until his father's sudden death. This event turned Thomas into a recluse, seeking solace in his work and befriending very few. He tutored himself in the Grand Library at Maryland House, yet also studied at the University College London on Gower Street. Even then, he isolated himself from other students. A bizarre quality of Maryland was his apparent permanent youthfulness. Even in his 80s, he still resembled a 40-year-old, albeit of odd complexion, and his few bizarre forays into the eyes of the media only furthered his infamy. He was accused of practicing dark arts to prolong his life. Yet, eminent scholars secretly allied themselves with him, encouraging him to share his collection with the world. In 1899, he took a small portion of his specimens on tour across America. Conservative attitudes of the time condemned these creatures, calling them blasphemous. His reaction was severe and the tour was cancelled before it reached California. In the following years, Maryland extended the collection exponentially. He traveled to the four corners of the earth and learned of ideologies and sciences which astounded those who corresponded with him. He held within his ranks a legion of colleagues who would benefit from his endless search. In truth, we did not know what he was searching for, until very recently. The collection houses mathematics not dreamt of in his time, of theories that we are only now contemplating. Maryland posits the possibilities of the multiverse, of time travel, of quantum mechanics, before the terms existed. Maryland is an enigma. He fell into obscurity, until 1942. The Tunbridge Orphanage for Boys was contacted by a man purporting to be Thomas Theodore Maryland, in the spring of that year. He wished to donate a sizable London townhouse to the orphanage for use once the war was over, and children returned. The only proviso was that the basement of the house never be opened and the house never sold. The orphanage stood by this promise, until absolved in the 60s and the existence of the cellar forgotten. Sealed behind 2 brick walls, the door was only found by chance when the foundations were checked prior to demolition. The Thomas Maryland pictured in a local newspaper, handing over the documents for ownership to the new proprietor, was in his 40s. By this time, Maryland would have been over 160 years old. The name sparked interest from those who had followed Maryland's work, most assuming him long dead. But the man claiming to be Thomas promptly disappeared, leaving no evidence of his existence. The Maryland estate was also sold off and money given to charity. What he left was the most incredible collection ever known: actual specimens of taxidermied dragons, the infant forms of werewolves, artifacts from ancient vampire nations, and the trappings of nefarious scientists whose existence was presumed to be mere fiction. It was this, and the apparent immortality of Maryland, that drove me to become rather fanatical about understanding the life of this man, and his world-changing collection. What had allowed him to live so long? Where had these specimens originated from, considering there are no other examples of these species to be found on the Earth?
My name is Alex Yeff, and I'm the curator and custodian of the Maryland Cryptid Collection, an extensive menagerie of extinct and unclassified preserved animal specimens, amongst them the supposed cadavers of creatures thought to be no more than myth. I was approached in 2007 to oversee the examination and documentation of Maryland's extensive diaries. I work alongside a team of specialists whose job it is to examine each study case to ascertain the history and the historical significance, the species and the research carried out by Maryland and his colleagues. The collection was the life's work of Thomas Theodore Maryland. He was a wealthy naturalist, born in 1782. He travelled alone extensively, seeking out items and specimens to add to his treasure trove. His collection itself grew exponentially, adding the preserved bodies of creatures that defied classification. Even into his late 80s, he continued to seek out elusive knowledge. Despite his great age, he never appeared to be any older than 40 years old. His collection soon became the stuff of legend, and he was all but forgotten until 1942, when a series of donations were made to an orphanage, including a London townhouse. And according to newspaper records, the donation came from Thomas Theodore Maryland. In 2006, the house was sold and was due for demolition. When the foundations were examined, a sealed room was found. Within this space were thousands of wooden shipping containers. On closer inspection, the crates were found to contain biological specimens, and the entire contents was moved from the cellar to a facility where it could be properly examined. I think I knew from the beginning that that they were all real, that it wasn't a hoax. I was presented with a wealth of information and all of these kind of self-contained studies of each species. The saving grace was Maryland's attention to detail. He was fastidious, he recorded everything, he presented everything in a very matter-of-fact way. You had thousands of biological samples and a wealth of annotated drawings, but I think the problem is that he spoke of ideas, anachronisms, that kind of, now looking back, you could doubt them. He was talking about DNA in the 1850s, and obviously DNA wasn't discovered until much later than that.
I was employed to examine a series of preserved animal cell samples, just told to analyse the samples and to record any interesting qualities. Although the cells appeared dead, they were in fact in a dormant state. I submerged them in a culture medium and managed to coax them back to life. These were 2,000-year-old skin cells, the DNA like nothing I'd ever seen before. After I submitted my findings to my superiors, I was asked if the cells could have been fabricated or interfered with to create such qualities. I said no. It was then that I was told what species these cells had come from.
And what species is that?
Homo vampirus.
I'm sorry?
The vampire.
To say werewolves and vampires existed seems somewhat ridiculous.
I think that so many of these species are kind of wrapped up in folklore and mythology, and the kind of core idea of a species is lost, because we're dealing with animals that existed in such small numbers that you can't really, there's not enough information. And I mean, Marilyn was recording this 100 years ago, and even then he was saying his studies would show that these species were dying out mainly through the encroachment of man into all areas of the world. But if you look at these species individually, for instance, the vampire, Homo vampirus, it's a hominid. It has an immunodeficiency virus. It's a virus which must have encountered at some point in its evolution. It changed its genetics to serve the virus, but it also benefited the host by extending its life. I think that you have to look at these things from a very matter-of-fact point of view, or you are lost in the kind of mythology and folklore of these species. You can talk about fairies and demons and dragons, but you're talking about the possibility that over thousands of years these myths have existed, and a lot of myths are at some point founded in reality. And I guess it's our job here to kind of piece those ideas together and find out if there is actually a valid species within all of that. I think the thing about Marilyn is that he presented a world that humans had chosen to ignore, and I think that that's important because we can lose ourselves in the matters of humans and kind of ignore the other species that we share this planet with.
Recorded that Marilyn disappeared in 1942. What do you think happened to it?
I'm convinced he's still alive.
Genesis 6:4 states, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men, and they had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Nephilim were a race of giants that were produced by the sexual union of the sons of God, or the fallen angels, and the daughters of men." Translated from Hebrew text, Nephilim means fallen ones. They were renowned for their strength, prowess, and a great capacity for sinfulness. They taught the blending of genetics to men. They created monsters. The cryptids that we will be seeing in the following videos are an analysis showing the sins of the fallen angels and the sins against God the Creator by blending one species with another, thus creating monsters.
Homonymous alatus. Larva non-volucres is a species of wingless homonymous which shares much of its anatomical traits with its winged relative. Examples of them are scarce, and mainly resigned to folklore, blamed for missing objects in the houses of 12th century peasants. They were often dubbed borrowers for their kleptomania, although rats and mice were a more obvious culprit. Constant references to people of diminutive stature fill the annals of many an occultist's memoirs. Larva non-volucres was in fact not a separate species of fairy, but a caste within the hive, foot soldiers if you will, born wingless with specific tasks to collect food, kill possible threats or seek out new nesting sites. Marilyn witnessed this in the Amazon, around the time he identified various other human mimics that fell under his broad umbrella of homonymous. Although many of these species were not related, they shared these unique humanoid attributes. Whilst tracking a number of larvae non-volucres, he noticed that they appeared to be returning from a hunt to a nest. When he saw that the nest was covered in settled winged homimimus, he concluded that they were about to attack. Yet to his surprise they entered the peculiar spout at the base of the mast and disappeared, only to appear again an hour later, exchanging pheromones with winged and wingless alike, and amongst their entourage, a queen fairy, her wings massive in comparison to those around her. He realized that this queen was relocating, either a recent newborn ready to make a new colony, or perhaps the nest was threatened. A day later, it was abandoned. On closer inspection, Marilyn found that the nest was plagued by some kind of fungal growth, hence the evacuation. He followed the procession to a new nesting site and with much excitement studied the construction of their second home. A mixture of a mucus-like excretion and leaf litter was used for the walls, the entire hive engaged in the task. Sadly, upon waking one morning, he found that construction had ceased. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fairies. They had succumbed to the spores spread by the fungi in the previous nest. He collected them and a number of them are presented here, showing the life cycle of this species. The prospect of caste systems within fairy hives fascinated him and he wished to find examples in his own country. On his return to England, he visited a number of homes which had reported sightings of these borrowers, and although it appeared that the species was no longer present in the British Isles, evidence of their hives remained. In the excavation of an outbuilding at the Rushley estate in Penningbourne, Marilyn found a massive nest built within the cavity wall. At its center a treasure trove of human objects, thimbles, pens, ribbons and coins. These were piled haphazardly within the chamber of the queen. Like magpies they appeared attracted to colorful or shiny objects and presented them to their majesty. Although fairy intelligence was like that of a bee or wasp, the bond between the regent and her subjects was very strong. Many species are known to collect objects, such as octopi, or various species of bird for courtship ritual or bonding, so this was not completely without precedent. These examples show the pupal stage of fairy development, a newborn, the preserved skeletal remains, 2 examples of wingless homomimus and a very young queen. Maryland Cryptid Museum, Part 2, Succubi. The cleric Abramo translated 2 texts from the Library of Venus. It was his life's work and was possibly the most difficult task he had ever undertaken. The books were written over a period of 6,000 years by the great thinker Glu, one of the first vampire. His words were the basis of the language of the vampire, known as Esot. Over the millennia the language evolved and so any system of decoding would have to be rethought every few chapters, and left alone in his task, Abramo struggled a great deal in his attempts to finally unravel the ideology of this secretive culture. In the late 18th century, an oil prospector in Texas found a series of caves below his land. He cursed this bad luck but decided to attempt to drill beneath this unfortunate void. Within the caverns, he found no sign of oil, but a faint orange light that seemed to phosphoresce in the dark. On closer inspection, the light emanated from huge stone masses that descended from the ceiling in conical forms. The lights were very faint, but sure enough, scattered the entire surface of the cones. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he noticed that these strange stone growths were actually collections of ossified bodies, hundreds of small childlike figures, huddled together, and the light seemed to come from their chests, 2 oblong amber shapes beneath the leather-like skin. He dug his pick into one and watched the liquid drain from the corpse. He dipped his finger in the resin and felt a bizarre sensation, one of great invigoration, a sense of well-being and strength. He collected a little of the substance and ingested it. 2 weeks passed and he had harvested an entire column of the strange mummified creatures that hung like stalactite mausoleum from his cave ceiling. His addiction to the substance which he called furnace had got the better of him and its physical effect was noticeable. To all intents and purposes, furnace was a form of adrenaline, with the qualities of a steroid. He was now collecting barrels of the glands from the presumed dead creatures and selling it at a huge price to townsfolk. It was soon common knowledge that a far greater wealth than oil could be found beneath the plains of Texas, and soon he was offered more money than he could ever wish for the land he now owned. But what he had found was not a boon. The creatures themselves were not dead, but in a state of suspended animation, and the glands stored a substance that would not only allow them to awaken but also to power their first flight. 4 times this creature had awoken since the dawn of life on the planet. In 280 million years, they had changed very little, existing in a state of serenity and peace as they slept, all of them part of cerebral network of thought that transcended our own understanding of existence, and all of them aware. And at the apex of their culture, the matriarch, the one Glu feared, the great receiver, through her the universe sings its agonizing song. They wanted only for 2 things, to sleep and be part of the lattice of thought, and to feed. And when they fed, they would gorge until there was nothing left, and then descend into the bowels of the earth and dream again for eternity. They are the succubi, and they will awaken. Draco-Elatus. 14th century Mongolia saw the death of the presumed last remaining male Draco-Elatus or winged dragon. With a dwindling matriarchal society with no males, this species would be one of many to face extinction at the hands of man. Hunted for nothing more than fear, Draco-Elatus, along with its wingless cousin, were the only other surviving Saurischia post the KT extinction, 65 million years ago. Carrying the membrane-winged attributes of the pterosaur with a theropod-hipped pelvis, Draco-Elatus survived in remote Far Eastern areas seemingly unaffected by the mass extinction. Along with the dinosaurs which would eventually evolve into birds, Draco-Elatus thrived in the 65 million years before man could become the force it is today. Draco-Elatus was one of a small subgroup of Theropoda which carried a unique self-igniting glandular secretion. In the throat were 4 glands containing an enzyme, when sprayed from the mouth, reacted with oxygen and ignited. According to the little research that is known, these bizarre pyrotechnics are unique to this species, and were used in courting and mating rituals. Many preserved dragon skins carry thick burn scars on their flanks, which clotted and healed in various bizarre patterns, not unlike keloid scarring in some human practices. Their skin is like that of a rhino, yet accented with tough scale-like plates along the spine. Their wingspan at adult size was around 80 feet. Their society was female-dominated, males being surprisingly smaller than the females. They are completely featherless, unlike most of their saurian cousins. The Maryland Cryptid collection added the head of a juvenile male Draco, and the bodies of several stillborn infants in 1876, after tracking down a remote group of Buddhist monks living in Gurkha, Nepal. They were entirely cut off from civilization and practiced a form of Buddhism known as Agni, Sanskrit for fire. To the surprise of the explorers, the monks revealed a large flock of Draco-Elatus living on the south side of a large mountain range. Dressed in colored fabrics and bridles, the dragons seemed almost domesticated. They were fed on flocks of cattle in the lower plains, seemingly deified by the monks. A young male had died earlier that year from a birth defect, and along with various stillborns, were buried near the monastery. To the horror of the monks, the explorers dug up and stole the head of the animal and the stillborn for their Western benefactor. On receiving this piece, Maryland himself returned to the monastery later that year to see these creatures in the flesh. The entire enclave and flock had vanished, leaving little evidence that they had ever existed. It is presumed that they left to find a more isolated place to continue their worship of these majestic beasts. Homunculi. The preserved body of a gnome-like creature, presented in a fine Edwardian miniature cabinet. Homunculi, or gnome. A diminutive hominid species found in the wilds of the Arctic Circle, they are the smallest known relative of Homo sapien. They build burrows like that of a badger, and use their large spade-like feet to dig these sets. Although their physiology is remarkably similar to us, their evolution has endowed them with some curious and fascinating traits. Homunculi were hunted to extinction for that very reason. Gnomes communicate via pheromones, released from scent glands in their hindquarters. They distinguish each other by these unique musky aromas, and within these scents are a variety of emotional and physiological tells, with which the colony can communicate many gestures and needs with a single note. Sadly, it became apparent that this musk is also a highly potent psychotropic substance, which is released when the animal is scared. The emissions will dull the senses of the aggressor and cause a sense of euphoria, described in the Schund Almanac and Ausbreeklichen Kulten as a window to the other realm. Further analysis of the substance shows a very similar chemical to psilocybin, which is found in certain species of psychoactive mushroom. Ingesting this will cause psychedelic hallucinations, and rather particular to this substance, hyper-exaggerated perception of reality, described by those exposed as the fairy realm. It is important to examine other fantastical tales linked to this species. During courtship, the males develop red downy filaments upon the head and down the spine. From a distance, this shock of red can be perceived a conical shape, rather like a hat. Homunculi are also tool users. Like other primate relatives, they use bone, wood and rock fragments to aid themselves, in this case, worn building. An example of a bone, chewed to a point, is presented here. In the 16th and 17th century, the creatures were caught and kept in cages and cowed into releasing clouds of musk, when agitated or starved. The animals would almost certainly die from malnutrition, as one of their main sources of food is a deep burrowing root, that supplies unique sugars needed in stabilizing blood sugar levels within their bodies. Without this they suffered a form of diabetes. Most if not all examples of gnome slavery as a form of drug culture, faded into obscurity, until Maryland heard of an unscrupulous quack doctor from America who was purported to have one in his possession. In 1858, Maryland traveled to New York and frequented many brothels and opium houses in search of this man. He found him at Madame LaRouge's secret garden. Before him a cage, and cowering in the corner of which, its body covered in scars from its master's cruel hand, was a living homunculi. Maryland searched the gentleman's belongings, and found a large medical bag, within which were many faux potions, bottles of arsenic and doping elixirs. Yet the most disturbing items were the 2 large glass jars containing what appeared to be women's uteri. Maryland dropped the man, took the bag and picked up the cage. He left and caught the fastest steamer back to England.
In 1912, the Royal Institute for Paleontological Research received news of a unique find in the Verkhayansk Range, eastern Siberia. The letter did not state what the find was, yet it intrigued the Russian-born head of the department, Alexei Zhukovsky, who was planning a trip to Russia that spring to visit colleagues. The find came with a price tag, and upon replying to the sender, he assured that payment would be made in full if the find was as rare as purported. When he reached Siberia, he found out that there was competition for the find. As letters had been sent to a number of scientific bodies, intrigued further by this news, he put together a team of scientists and travelled to Lena, where they met a group of locals who would take them to the site of the auspicious find. They had managed to beat the other parties to the find, yet for an hour the owner and his hired hand, Pafnuty Shebyshev, demanded payment before the find was shown to the party. Eventually, Alexei paid the man, only to be confronted with something that challenged everything he knew of Saurian evolutionary biology. Before him, a creature that had been removed from the ancient permafrost of a subterranean mountain glacier some 40 miles north in a unique spot of almost permanent sub-zero temperatures. Preserved almost perfectly intact, although it was obvious that it had gone through many defrosting and refreezing processes, was an animal that would elevate many scientific theories, a perfect still image taken almost 65 million years before. The creature was a subspecies of the Ornithosaurus of the family Dromaeosauridae, an order of bird-like theropod dinosaurs. They were small carnivores that flourished in the Cretaceous period. A few scientists have theorized that these animals were the precursor of birds, the strongest evidence being that the Archaeopteryx, discovered in 1861, only 2 years after Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and it became a key piece of evidence in the debate over evolution. The specimen itself was not fossilized but preserved, and Letsky hypothesized that the initial freezing must have sterilized the creature of all microbial bacteria, ceasing all decomposition, and the final resting place of the animal in a frozen underground river had allowed, beyond all reason, a perfectly preserved form. Its body was covered in down, which formed proto-feathers at the wrists, concealing 3-fingered digits tipped with razor-sharp claws. Nearly every feature of the animal was intact, from eyes to the pigmentation in its skin. Dull reds and browns accented the tiny creature, the evolutionary missing link between the dinosaur and the bird. The find was taken back to England and a post-mortem was carried out. The creature's stomach and digestive tract still contained its last meal, and it was found to contain high levels of salt. Once Zaleski had time to analyse the animal, he surmised that for an animal to be so well preserved after such a long time, it must have remained in a vacuum-like state. The salt was attributed to seawater, yet the unique conditions in which the animal had existed was never fully understood. To secure the stability of its fragile body, it was injected with various preservatives and given pride of place in the lobby of the Institute for Scientific Discourse. He remained there for a few months until the story of the plateau in South America became headline news. Alexei was invited to see similar specimens brought back from this place that time forgot. Many now believe that the Ornithosaur had actually originated from the plateau and not a subterranean glacier, yet how it managed to end up in Siberia was never explained. The story and the specimen remain a mystery and disappeared into the annals of time. Hidden in the storage facility of the Institute, returned to the crate it was originally shipped in, along with the original customs and excise forms, a handful of illustrations and photos, and the various detritus that was attached to it once defrosted. 100 years later, Mongolia will be the site of hundreds more fossilized dromaeosaurs and other feathered dinosaurs, the final missing pages in the development of flight.
Could all these findings in fact be real? Could this all be a hoax? I don't know. From what I've been researching, this is either the work of an extremely talented artist, or it is indeed true that these things were hidden away underneath the building, and they were really found, and they did really exist. I don't know. I can't say for sure on anything. All I can say is that this information is very, very interesting, and it does correlate with the things that were done, and it does correlate with mythology and the things that we know from the Bible and Genesis 6 and from the books of Enoch and Jasher, of the mixing and blending of species one with another in order to provoke the Lord. And we do know through a lot of the evidence that has been found in Peru with the elongated skulls. Among many, many, many other things that we find out there, we must always search for the truth to find answers. I am not going to say if this information is 100% true or if it is all fake, because I don't know. It is getting increasingly harder to be able to tell on the internet what is true and what is not. To me, what if this stuff is 100% true and then they just make it look like it's artwork, or make it look to pass it off as if it is fake when it may be real? I don't know. But what we do know is that the biblical references to the Rephaim and the Nephilim and Amalek and the Philistines and all these tribes that were mentioned throughout the scripture of being vampire-like and giants, being fearsome, bloodthirsty warriors, these stories we know to be true throughout the history of the scripture and the history that has been uncovered in the Middle East. All the biblical references to all these entities have been found. Even the Smithsonian themselves have admitted to destroying thousands of Nephilim giant skeletons. The ancients did not write of these things or draw pictures of these things out of their imaginations, for we know the scriptures say, "There is no new thing under the sun. What has been shall be again."